The courtroom fell silent when the judge looked down at the woman seated alone at the far table and asked Mrs. Carter, "Do you understand that if you proceed today, you may walk out of this building with nothing?" Every head turned toward her. Laura Carter did not answer right away. Her hands rested flat on the polished wood fingers, still nails trimmed short. She was wearing a navy coat that had been cleaned too many times, the fabric soft at the elbows. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, no makeup, no jewelry except a thin gold band she had stopped wearing months ago. She looked like someone who had already been written out of the story. Across the aisle, Daniel Carter exhaled through his nose and leaned back in his chair. 61 years old. Broad shoulders still holding the shape of authority. A charcoal suit cut perfectly to his frame. His jaw tight, his mouth set in that familiar line people mistook for discipline when it was really control. To the men beside him, it looked like confidence. To Laura, it looked like a door closing. Daniel did not look at her. He was watching his attorney, Mark Feldman, who stood calmly with one hand resting on the back of Daniel's chair, fingers splayed like a claim. Mark was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, voice smooth from decades of courtrooms and conference rooms. He had the posture of someone who never doubted where power belonged. "Your Honor," Mark said, stepping forward, "my client has been more than patient. This marriage has been over in every meaningful way for years. Today is simply paperwork. Paperwork." The word landed hard. Laura finally lifted her eyes. Not to Daniel, to the judge. Her gaze was steady, but something flickered there. Not fear, not confusion, calculation. The kind that comes from watching a storm approach and choosing not to run. "I understand," she said quietly. Her voice carried, not loud, not weak. It cut clean through the room. Daniel's lips twitched, a half smile, gone in a second. The gallery was small. A few reporters Daniel's firm had tipped off. 2 junior associates whispering behind legal pads, a court officer standing near the door, arms crossed watching the clock. No family, no friends, no one sitting behind Laura. That absence was loud. Daniel had made sure of that. For 34 years, he had controlled the narrative. In the house, in the boardroom, in the quiet spaces where decisions were made without witnesses. Laura had been useful once. Organized. Loyal. Invisible when needed. He had called it partnership. She had called it marriage. Now he called it over. Mark continued, voice measured. Mrs. Carter voluntarily stepped away from her role in the company decades ago. She signed the exit agreement. She chose to focus on the home. There is no claim to ongoing compensation. Daniel nodded once, slow. The judge glanced down at the file, then back up. "Mrs. Carter, your counsel." Laura turned her head slightly. Beside her sat a young man who looked like he had slept in his suit. Evan Morales, 32. Public defender temporarily assigned after her original attorney withdrew 3 weeks earlier. He swallowed, adjusted his tie, leaned in. "We object to," Evan started, then faltered when Mark turned and fixed him with a polite smile that carried a warning. "We object to the characterization that Mrs. Carter had no involvement." Mark didn't raise his voice. "With respect, counselor, your client has no documentation to support that claim." Daniel watched Evan closely now. He recognized the posture, the tightening shoulders, the shallow breath. The look of someone realizing the ground beneath them was thinner than they thought. This was the moment Daniel enjoyed. The moment before people broke. Laura placed a hand lightly on Evan's sleeve. He looked at her, eyes wide, searching for direction. She gave him a small nod, not reassurance. "Permission." Mark turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to finalize today. He has already agreed to a generous one-time settlement, which Mrs. Carter declined against legal advice. Daniel shifted forward, finally looking at her. "Laura," he said softly, like he was speaking to an old habit. "You don't need to make this harder than it is." She met his gaze. For the first time that morning, Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, irritation. The look in her eyes was wrong. Too calm. Too present. "You always said," she replied, "that truth doesn't need volume." A few heads in the gallery lifted. Mark cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if we may proceed." The judge raised a hand. "One moment." He leaned back slightly, studying Laura. "Mrs. Carter, this court needs to be certain you understand the consequences. Once this is finalized, there is no reopening." Laura inhaled, slow, controlled. The sound barely audible, but Daniel heard it. He had learned her rhythms over decades. This was the breath she took before making a decision she would not explain. "I understand," she said again. "And I'm ready." Daniel exhaled, satisfied. He reached for the pen on the table, rolling it once between his fingers. The weight of it felt familiar, like a signature on a deal already closed. Mark slid the document forward. That was when the sound came from the back of the courtroom. Not loud, not dramatic. The low, unmistakable click of the heavy doors unlocking. The court officer turned first, then the judge. Daniel frowned and glanced over his shoulder. 3 men entered. Dark suits, no briefcases, no rush. They moved with the kind of quiet coordination Daniel had only seen in secure boardrooms and private terminals. One of them spoke briefly to the court officer, showing a badge Daniel couldn't quite see from where he sat. The officer's posture changed. Mark stiffened. Just slightly. Laura did not turn around. Daniel felt the room shift. Not panic, pressure, like the air before a storm breaks. The judge straightened. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The man in front stepped forward. Late 60s, tall, lean, white hair cut close, military neat. His eyes were clear sharp and completely uninterested in Daniel Carter. "Apologies for the interruption." "Your Honor," the man said. His voice was calm, even, used to being obeyed without raising it. "We were delayed." Delayed. Laura closed her eyes for half a second. Daniel's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table, clattering softly against the wood. The man's gaze finally shifted. Not to Daniel, to Laura. He nodded once. Respect. Familiar. "Are you ready?" he asked. Laura opened her eyes. "Yes," she said. Daniel's mouth went dry. He had no idea who the man was. No idea why his presence felt like a door slamming somewhere far behind him. No idea why, for the first time in decades, he suddenly felt unsure of the outcome he had already rehearsed in his head. Mark leaned in, voice low. "Daniel," he whispered, "we need a moment." Daniel did not answer. His eyes were locked on Laura, who was standing now, slowly, with purpose. The way she used to stand in the early years before she learned how small she was expected to be. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, who is this Laura, did not look away from Daniel. "You'll know soon enough," she said. Daniel Carter had always believed silence meant control, but as Laura stood beside the unfamiliar man, the quiet in the courtroom felt different. It pressed in from every angle, thick and uncooperative, like a weight that refused to settle where Daniel expected it to. Mark Feldman was the first to recover. He straightened his jacket, smoothed the crease at his sleeve, and stepped forward with a polite, practiced smile. "Your Honor, I'm not sure who these gentlemen are, but this hearing is already in progress." The silver-haired man didn't look at Mark. He didn't look at the judge either. He looked only at Laura, as if confirming she was still exactly where she needed to be. When he finally spoke, it was measured, almost gentle. "We won't take long." The judge frowned. "Sir, this is a closed proceeding." "Not any more," the man replied. Daniel felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest. "This is inappropriate," he said louder than he intended. His voice echoed, slightly betraying him. "Who are you?" The man turned then, slowly. His eyes met Daniel's for the first time. There was no hostility in them, no challenge, just assessment. The way one looks at a structure already compromised, already marked for inspection. "My name is Samuel Wright," he said, "and I'm here because your wife asked me to come." Daniel laughed sharp and brittle. "My wife doesn't ask people like you for favors." Laura turned her head just enough to look at him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held something colder now. "You never knew who I asked for anything, Daniel." Evan Morales shifted beside her, confusion etched across his face. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered. "What's happening?" Laura placed her hand on the table again, grounding herself. "You're doing fine, Evan. Just stay with me." Mark stepped in front of Daniel, slightly protective. "Your Honor, unless Mr. Wright is counsel of record, I move that he be removed." Samuel Wright reached into his coat and produced a slim folder. He handed it to the court officer without ceremony. The officer flipped it open, scanned the contents, then stiffened. He walked it to the bench. The judge read. His eyebrows rose. He read again, slower this time. Daniel leaned forward. "What is that?" The judge looked up. "It appears this court has been notified of a parallel filing submitted early this morning. Federal jurisdiction." Mark's smile vanished. "That's not possible." "It is," Samuel said. "And it's already been accepted." Laura exhaled softly. Daniel's heart began to pound. "Accepted for what?" "For review," the judge replied carefully. "Regarding potential misrepresentation, fiduciary breach, and concealment of material interests." Daniel felt heat rush to his face. "This is absurd. My wife has no assets, no standing. She signed away her role years ago." Laura looked at him fully now. "You told me to trust you," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You told me paperwork was just paperwork." The words landed harder than any accusation. Mark tried again, his tone sharper. "Your Honor, this is a transparent delay tactic." Samuel shook his head once. "No, this is timing." He turned to Laura. "Would you like to explain, or should I?" She considered that. The courtroom held its breath. "I'll explain," she said. She stepped forward, moving away from the table where she had sat small and contained for most of the morning. Her posture shifted. Shoulders back, chin level. The years of practiced quiet didn't disappear, but they rearranged themselves into something deliberate. "I met Daniel when I was 26, she began. "He was ambitious, brilliant. He talked about building something that mattered. He asked me to help him review projections, strategy drafts, early contracts. I did, at night, at the kitchen table." Daniel opened his mouth. Mark raised a hand, urging restraint. "I didn't put my name on anything," Laura continued, "because I didn't need to. I believed partnership meant trust." Samuel watched Daniel closely now. When the company took off, Daniel said it was better if I stepped back. That visibility would complicate things. He said it kindly, like a favor. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I signed what he put in front of me," she said, "because I loved him, and because I believed that what we were building together couldn't be taken from me by ink." Mark scoffed softly. "This is sentiment, not law." Laura turned her head toward him. "You're right," she said. "It's not law." She looked back at the judge. "That's why I waited." Samuel stepped forward now, placing a document on the bench with care. Mrs. Carter didn't step away from business, he said. She stepped sideways. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears. What does that mean? It means, Samuel replied, that while you were running day-to-day operations, Mrs. Carter was establishing a private trust, one that acquired interests you didn't consider relevant because they didn't look like power. Mark shook his head. This is nonsense. Samuel smiled faintly. That's what everyone says before they look closer. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Wright, are you asserting that Mrs. Carter holds controlling interests related to Mr. Carter's enterprise? Yes, Samuel said. Indirectly, quietly, legally, the word echoed. Daniel stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. This is a lie. Laura didn't flinch. You taught me patience, she said. You said timing was everything, Samuel added. Over the past 15 years, Mrs. Carter's trust has acquired debt positions, licensing rights, and minority stakes through intermediaries. All public, all documented, all overlooked. Mark's face had gone pale. He leaned toward Daniel, whispering urgently, We need a recess. Daniel ignored him. Why now? He demanded, voice cracking. Why do this now? Laura met his eyes, and for a moment something human surfaced there. Sadness, not regret, recognition. Because you stopped seeing me, she said. And when someone stops seeing you, that's when you decide whether to disappear or step into the light. The judge raised a hand. Mrs. Carter, are you claiming financial leverage relevant to this proceeding? Laura nodded. Yes. And are you prepared to substantiate it? Samuel slid another folder forward. Thicker this time. Yes, Laura said. The judge leaned back, absorbing the shift. Mr. Feldman, it appears this court will require time to review these filings. Mark swallowed. Your Honor, I am granting a temporary suspension of today's proceedings, the judge said. Effective immediately. The gavel came down once. Solid. Final. Daniel stood frozen as the sound echoed. Around him whispers broke out. Pens scribbled. Phones buzzed. The reporter's eyes were alive now, hungry. Laura turned away from the bench and walked toward Daniel. She stopped just short of him. This isn't revenge, she said quietly. It's balance. Daniel searched her face, desperate now for the woman he had controlled, the one who deferred the one who believed him. He didn't find her. He found someone else. Samuel placed a hand lightly at Laura's back. Not possessive, protective. We're not finished, he said to Daniel. We're just beginning. And as Laura walked toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps steady against the floor. Daniel Carter realized that for the first time in his life, he no longer understood the room he was standing in. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, but Daniel Carter barely registered it as he stood frozen, watching Laura disappear through the double doors with Samuel Wright at her side. The sound of the doors closing behind her landed heavier than the judge's gavel had. It wasn't loud. It was final. Mark Feldman grabbed Daniel's arm, fingers digging in just enough to get his attention. We need to talk, he said under his breath. Now! Daniel yanked his arm free. What the hell just happened? Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the hallway, already calculating who might be listening. A young reporter pretended to scroll on her phone. 2 court clerks whispered near the water fountain. Mark leaned closer. We walk, we don't say a word. Not yet. Daniel's chest felt tight as they moved down the corridor. Every step echoed too loudly. He could feel eyes on his back. He had spent his life being watched with admiration. This felt different. This felt like assessment. They reached the elevator bank. Daniel stabbed the button with more force than necessary. "You told me she had nothing," he hissed. "You told me this was clean." Mark's jaw clenched. "I told you what was visible." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. They stepped inside. Mark hit the button for the ground floor, then finally turned. "Daniel, listen to me. Whatever Laura is holding, she's been holding it for a long time." Daniel laughed, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the mirrored walls. "That's impossible. I saw every account, every statement. I built the structure." "You built the structure you wanted to see," Mark replied. "That's not the same thing." The elevator descended. The silence stretched. Daniel's mind raced back through years he had long dismissed as settled. Late nights when Laura sat across from him quiet, flipping through spreadsheets while he talked. Her questions, precise, calm. The way she never argued, never pushed, but always seemed to remember details he forgot. He had mistaken that for passivity. He always did. The doors opened to the lobby. A flood of sound rushed in. Voices, footsteps, the distant hum of traffic outside. Mark guided Daniel toward a side exit, away from the press gathering near the main doors. "Get me answers," Daniel said. "Now." "You'll get them," Mark replied, "but not today." Outside, the cold air hit Daniel's face like a slap. He stood on the courthouse steps staring at the city he thought he controlled. Cars passed. People moved. Life continued. That was wrong. Everything should have stopped. Across the street, a black sedan idled. The back door opened. Laura stepped inside. Daniel felt something crack in his chest. Inside the car, Laura sat back against the leather seat and closed her eyes. Her hands trembled for the first time all day, not from fear, from release. Samuel Wright watched her carefully, giving her the moment without comment. "You okay?" he asked finally. She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I didn't think it would feel like this." Samuel gave a small, knowing smile. "It rarely feels the way people imagine." The car pulled into traffic, the courthouse shrinking behind them. "Daniel is going to fight," Samuel said. "I know. And he's going to be loud about it." Laura opened her eyes, gazing out the window at the blur of buildings. "He always is." Samuel studied her profile. "You could have done this years ago." She breathed out slowly. "Then it would have been about anger, not truth." The car turned onto a quieter street. Laura straightened slightly, her composure returning piece by piece. "What happens next?" Samuel reached into his briefcase. "Next, we stop playing defense." Back at Daniel's apartment, the silence was unbearable. He paced the living room phone pressed to his ear, listening to the hollow ring as another call went unanswered. His reflection in the darkened window looked older than it had that morning, less certain. Mark finally arrived, coat still on, eyes tired. "I've made some calls," he said. And whatever Laura set up, it's insulated. Layers. Independent trustees. Shell entities that don't point back to her name directly. Daniel slammed his fist into the back of a chair. She was a housewife. Mark flinched at the word. She was observant. Daniel stopped pacing. "You're telling me my own wife built something under my nose for decades, and I never saw it?" "I'm telling you," Mark said carefully, "that you never looked." Daniel sank into the sofa, hands gripping his knees. His mind replayed the moment Laura stood in court, the way she spoke, the calm authority in her voice. That wasn't new. It was revealed. "What do we do?" Daniel asked, quieter now. Mark hesitated. "We prepare for exposure." "Exposure of what?" "Of everything you assumed was private." Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. "You should turn on the news." His stomach dropped. He grabbed the phone and switched on the television. Laura's face filled the screen, Not in a courtroom, not as a defendant. She stood at a podium in a quiet conference room, a neutral backdrop behind her. No jewelry. Simple blazer. Calm eyes. Reporters crowded in front of her, microphones raised. "I'm not here to attack my husband," she said, her voice steady through the speakers. "I'm here to clarify a misunderstanding." Daniel's heart pounded. "For years," Laura continued, "I chose not to be visible. That was my decision. Not because I lacked ability, but because I believed some work is more effective when done quietly." The reporter's voice cut in. "Mrs. Carter, are you confirming that you hold financial interests related to your husband's company?" Laura nodded. "Yes." The room seemed to tilt. "I also want to be clear," she said. "This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability." Daniel stared at the screen, his mouth dry. "Too late," Mark muttered. Laura's gaze shifted slightly, as if she were looking straight through the camera. "When power goes unchecked," she said, "it doesn't just hurt marriages, it hurts systems." I stayed quiet long enough to understand how those systems work. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Then again. Calls, messages, board members, investors, numbers he recognized and numbers he didn't. He didn't answer. On the screen, Laura finished her statement. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any review process. Transparency shouldn't be feared." The broadcast cut back to the anchor voice, buzzing with urgency. Daniel turned off the television. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air thin. Mark stood slowly. "Daniel," he said, "we're past the point of controlling the story." Daniel didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the dark screen, reflecting his own face back at him, a man who had built an empire on the belief that silence meant loyalty and invisibility meant weakness. Somewhere across the city, Laura Carter was finally being seen, and Daniel knew with a cold certainty settling deep in his gut that this was only the beginning. By morning, Daniel Carter's name had slipped into every financial feed that mattered, and not in the way he was used to seeing it. The headlines didn't accuse him outright. They didn't need to. They asked questions. Quiet ones, careful ones, the kind that unsettled markets and kept compliance officers awake before dawn. Daniel stood in his kitchen, staring at his phone, coffee, untouched suit jacket draped over the back of a chair like something abandoned in a hurry. He had slept for less than an hour. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura at that podium, calm, precise, unafraid. Mark Feldman arrived just after 7, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "The board is calling an emergency session." Daniel didn't look up. "They don't have grounds. They have pressure," Mark replied. "And pressure creates grounds." Daniel finally turned. "She doesn't own the company." "She doesn't need to," Mark said. "She owns leverage." The word hung between them. What kind, Daniel demanded. Mark hesitated. "We're still mapping it. But the filings Samuel Wright referenced weren't theater. There are debt instruments connected to subsidiaries you stopped paying attention to years ago. Licensing agreements tied to core patents. Nothing illegal on its face, just positioned." Daniel's laugh came out hollow. "She was filing grocery receipts." "She was filing paperwork," Mark corrected. "You just didn't know which paperwork mattered." Daniel grabbed his keys. "I'm going in." Mark stepped into his path. "That's a mistake. I'm the CEO." "For now," Mark said carefully. "And if you walk into that building today, every camera will follow. Every word will be dissected." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not hiding." Mark watched him for a long moment. "This isn't hiding. This is choosing where you stand when the ground shifts." Daniel pushed past him. The drive downtown felt longer than usual. Traffic lights blurred. Horns sounded distant. When he pulled into the underground garage, the familiar security gate paused before lifting. A second longer than normal. Long enough for Daniel to notice. Inside the elevator, his reflection stared back at him. The man in the glass looked composed, controlled. But the eyes gave him away. Too alert, too sharp. Like an animal sensing a trap. The doors opened onto his floor. The office was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. People sat at their desks, typing, answering phones, pretending not to look up. They looked up anyway, just for a second. Then away. Daniel walked straight toward the executive wing. The boardroom doors were closed. That was new. He reached for the handle. "Daniel," a voice said behind him. He turned. Margaret Ellis stood a few feet away, tablet tucked under her arm. 72. One of the original board members. A woman who had seen companies rise and fall and never mistook speed for strength. Her expression was unreadable. "Where are you going?" she asked. "My office," Daniel replied. She shook her head once. "The board is in session. You didn't notify me." She held his gaze. "We notified counsel." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "Open the door." Margaret didn't move. "You should wait." Daniel stepped closer. "I built this company." Margaret's voice remained calm. "And you may have underestimated who else helped sustain it." Daniel stared at her. "You knew." "I suspected," she said. Laura asked better questions than most executives. A murmur rose behind the doors. Voices. Familiar ones. Daniel's chest tightened. "Daniel," Margaret said softly, "this isn't an ambush. It's a reckoning." He pushed past her and opened the door. The room fell silent. Every seat was filled. At the head of the table sat Laura, not in the gray coat from court, not in the blazer from the press conference. She wore a charcoal suit that fit her perfectly, hair loose around her shoulders, glasses perched lightly on her nose. Papers were spread neatly in front of her, a tablet to her right. Samuel Wright stood near the window, hands folded behind his back. Daniel's breath caught. Laura looked up. Their eyes met. "Daniel," she said. Her tone was professional, neutral, like she was greeting a colleague. He felt the room spin. "What is this?" Samuel stepped forward. "A special session of the board." "You don't have the authority," Daniel snapped. Laura tilted her head slightly. "Actually, I do." She tapped the tablet once. The screen behind her lit up. Numbers filled the wall. Daniel recognized them immediately. Revenue streams, asset allocations, lines he hadn't reviewed in years because they never seemed urgent. Laura stood. "Over the last 20 years, I observed how decisions were made here," she said. "Who spoke, who stayed quiet, where power flowed." Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I didn't challenge you," she continued. "Not because I couldn't, because I wanted to understand the system before engaging it." Samuel added, "Mrs. Carter's trust holds significant influence over several entities essential to this company's operational liquidity." Margaret Ellis spoke up. "Including debt obligations that mature this quarter." Daniel's heart pounded. "You're strangling the company." Laura met his gaze. "No, I'm revealing its dependence." A board member cleared his throat. "Laura, are you proposing a change in leadership?" Daniel laughed. "This is insane." Laura didn't look away from him. "I'm proposing accountability." She turned to the board. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in stability. And right now this company is exposed." Daniel took a step forward. You're doing this to punish me. Her eyes softened just a fraction. I'm doing this because I watched you ignore warning signs for years. Because you mistook silence for consent. Because you forgot that trust is a resource and resources run out. The room was deadly quiet. Samuel spoke again. The motion on the table is temporary suspension pending review. Daniel's fists clenched. You can't remove me. Margaret looked at him with something like regret. We can, she said. And we may have to. Daniel scanned the faces around the table. Men and women who had once deferred to him now avoided his eyes. Not out of malice, out of acceptance. He looked back at Laura. You planned this, he said. She nodded, carefully. From the beginning, she shook her head. From the moment I realized you no longer saw me. The vote was quick, too quick. When it was over, Daniel was still standing. Laura sat back down. Samuel placed a document in front of him. You'll be notified of next steps. Daniel didn't move. Security appeared at the door. Familiar faces. Men who used to nod when he passed. Mr. Carter. One of them said quietly, We need to escort you out. Daniel turned back to Laura one last time. You think this makes you powerful? She held his gaze steady and unflinching. No, she said. I think it makes me honest. As Daniel was guided toward the exit, the doors closing behind him with a soft, deliberate click. Laura exhaled for the first time in hours. The room buzzed with low conversation, decisions already forming. Samuel leaned closer. You did well. Laura stared at the empty chair Daniel had left behind. I did what was necessary. Outside, Daniel stood on the sidewalk, the building rising above him, glass reflecting a city that suddenly felt indifferent. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure where he belonged. And for the first time, Laura Carter was sitting at the table where decisions were made, fully aware that the hardest part was still ahead. The first subpoena arrived before Daniel Carter finished his second drink, slid across the polished bar by a bartender who didn't meet his eyes. Daniel stared at the envelope as if it were something alive, something that might bite if he touched it. The television above the bar flickered with muted financial news. His name scrolled along the bottom, framed by words like review and inquiry and governance. No accusations. Not yet. The restraint was worse. He opened the envelope anyway. The paper inside was crisp, official, indifferent. Requests for documents, communications, records. The language was precise, polite, unforgiving. Daniel folded it once, then again, tucking it into his jacket like a secret he could still keep. Across the room, two men in suits leaned together, whispering. One of them glanced Daniel's way, then quickly looked down. Daniel finished his drink and stood the stool, scraping loudly against the floor. He could feel the room recalibrating around him, as if an invisible hand had adjusted the lights. Outside, the night air cut through him. He pulled his coat tighter and walked without direction, phone pressed to his ear. Voicemail. Again. He lowered the phone, jaw clenched, and stared at the street. Taxis passed. Laughter drifted from a restaurant doorway. Life continued with a casual cruelty. At the same time, several floors above the city, Laura sat alone in the conference room. Lights dimmed the long table, reflecting her tired eyes. The building hummed softly around her, systems running as they always had. She loosened her collar and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Samuel Wright entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down near her hand. You've been here since dawn. She nodded. I needed to be. Samuel studied her face. He won't stop. I know. He'll try to shift blame. He'll make noise. Laura wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth steady her. Noise doesn't scare me. Silence used to. Samuel said nothing. He knew better than to fill that space. The door opened again. Margaret Ellis stepped in, tablet under her arm, expression serious. The board wants clarity. Laura straightened. On what? On how far this goes, Margaret said, and how public it becomes. Laura considered that. Truth has a way of surfacing whether we invite it or not. Margaret nodded. They're worried about reputational damage. Laura met her gaze. So am I. Margaret softened slightly. Then tell me this is necessary. Laura didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the table at the faint scratches left by years of meetings, deals, arguments. It is, she said finally. Because pretending costs more. Margaret exhaled. Then we stand with you. Back in his apartment, Daniel paced, tie-loosened jacket tossed aside. The walls felt closer now, the air heavy. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. What he snapped. Mark Feldman's voice came through strained. You need to listen. Daniel stopped pacing. I'm listening. I've reviewed the filings Laura's team submitted. They're thorough. Daniel scoffed. They always look thorough until you pull the thread. Mark hesitated. The thread leads back to you. Daniel closed his eyes. You said this was manageable. It was, Mark replied quietly. Before the Oversight Committee requested independent audits. Daniel's stomach dropped. Independent? Yes. Daniel's laugh was bitter. She's turning my own company against me. No, Mark said. She's letting it look. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Mark spoke again. There's something else. Daniel gripped the edge of the counter. Say it. The trust Laura controls acquired a controlling interest in the debt you used to refinance 3 years ago. Daniel's breath caught. He remembered that deal. Late night, rushed signatures, a temporary fix. That debt was buried. It was invisible, Mark said. Until now. Daniel slid down onto the sofa, head in his hands. So what happens? Best case, Mark replied. You negotiate. Worst case, they unravel everything. Daniel's jaw tightened. I won't beg. Mark didn't respond. The next morning, Laura stood at the window of her office, watching the city wake up. She had slept for 4 hours. Enough. She felt strangely calm. The chaos had a shape now. She could see it. Samuel entered with a folder. Daniel's counsel reached out. Laura turned. Already. He wants a private meeting. Laura took the folder, flipping it open. Notes, timelines, names. He wants to control the setting. Samuel nodded. Of course he does. Laura closed the folder. Tell him I'll meet. With conditions. Which are? She looked back at the city. Transparency. Samuel smiled faintly. He won't like that. He never did. Daniel arrived at the neutral office space an hour early, pacing the hallway, hands shoved into his pockets. When Laura entered, flanked by Samuel, Daniel straightened instinctively, the old reflex kicking in before he could stop it. Laura, he said, forcing a smile. You look well. She nodded once. Daniel. They sat across from each other at a small table. No board, no audience. Just the quiet hum of the building. You've made your point, Daniel began. This doesn't have to get ugly. Laura folded her hands. It already is. Daniel leaned forward. We can settle this. Privately. Settle what she asked. Our differences, he said. The company. The marriage. Laura's eyes didn't waver. Those are different things. Daniel's voice sharpened. You're destroying everything we built. She inhaled slowly. We didn't build it together at the end. You took over. You decided. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Samuel spoke. Mr. Carter, this meeting is about process, not persuasion. Daniel glanced at him, irritation flaring. Stay out of this. Samuel didn't move. I am in it. Laura watched Daniel closely. For the first time, she saw fear beneath the anger. Not panic. Calculation under strain. You always thought leverage came from being louder, she said. From being first. From being certain. Daniel scoffed. And you think hiding makes you strong? I think listening does, she replied. And I listened to you for years. Silence settled between them. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face. What do you want? Laura considered him. I want the truth documented. I want accountability. And I want you to stop pretending this is about me. He laughed bitter. Everything is about you. No, she said. It's about systems you benefited from and ignored. Daniel stood abruptly. You won't win this. Laura didn't rise. I already have. He stared at her, searching for doubt. He found none. When he left the door closing softly behind him, Laura sat still for a long moment. Her hands trembled slightly now. She let them. The weight of years pressed in, then eased. Samuel spoke quietly. You okay? She nodded. I am. Outside, Daniel stepped into the street, the city roaring back into focus. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages he hadn't read. Investors, reporters, unknown numbers. He realized then that the fight he was entering wasn't one he could win by force or charm. It was one fought with patience, with records, with time. And time for the first time was not on his side. The hearing room was smaller than the courtroom Daniel remembered from his victories, windowless and deliberately plain, designed to strip away spectacle. Daniel sat at the narrow table, hands folded too tightly, watching the clock on the wall tick with mechanical indifference. The numbers blurred. He had been early again. Control was a habit he could not break, even now. Across the room, Laura reviewed a stack of documents with Samuel Wright and a woman Daniel did not recognize. Mid-50s, calm eyes, hair pulled back. She wore a simple gray suit and moved with the confidence of someone who did not need to introduce herself to be taken seriously. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was brief. Daniel leaned toward Mark Feldman. Who is she? Mark's voice was low. Independent examiner. Appointed this morning. Daniel felt a sharp jolt. By whom? By request, Mark said. Mutual. Daniel shot him a look. I didn't agree to that. Mark didn't meet his eyes. You agreed to transparency. The door closed. The hum of the ventilation system grew louder. The examiner cleared her throat. This is an informal session, she said. No cameras, no statements for the press. Today is about facts. Daniel nodded, jaw set. Laura looked at him then, not with anger, with something more dangerous. Clarity. The examiner continued. We're here to address inconsistencies identified during preliminary review. Mr. Carter, your counsel has provided documentation supporting your claim that certain decisions were operational, not personal. Daniel straightened slightly. That's correct. The examiner turned a page. However, there are discrepancies. Daniel's pulse quickened. She slid a document across the table. This email thread. Daniel glanced at it. His stomach tightened. He recognized the timestamp. Late night. A message he had sent without thinking twice. Laura watched his reaction, her expression unreadable. The examiner spoke evenly. In this exchange, you reference moving resources to avoid oversight. Daniel looked up. That was strategic. Strategic to whom the examiner asked. Daniel hesitated. To protect the company. Laura spoke for the first time. From accountability, Daniel's eyes snapped to her. You don't get to redefine my intentions. I don't need to, she replied. They're documented. The examiner held up a hand. Mr. Carter, there is also evidence suggesting personal benefit tied to these decisions. Daniel laughed sharp. That's an interpretation. Is it, the examiner asked? Because the timing aligns with significant personal expenditures. Mark shifted uncomfortably. Laura leaned back slightly, hands folded. She said nothing. Daniel's voice rose. This is a witch hunt. The examiner's gaze remained steady. No. This is review. She turned another page. There's also the matter of governance. Several board decisions were made without full disclosure. Daniel bristled. That's standard. Laura interjected, her tone calm but firm. It's standard when trust exists. The room went still. Daniel stared at her. You're enjoying this. Laura met his gaze. No. Then why do you look so calm? She paused, choosing her words. Because I prepared for it. Daniel leaned back, exhaling sharply. You prepared to destroy me. She shook her head. I prepared to survive you. The examiner closed the folder. We'll take a recess. Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. He paced near the wall, hands clenched, mind racing. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Mark approached quietly. You need to be careful. Daniel laughed bitterly. Careful? Yes, Mark said. Because they're not attacking you head on, they're letting you talk. Daniel stopped pacing. What does that mean? It means, Mark replied, every word you say becomes evidence. Across the room, Laura stood with Samuel and the examiner. Samuel's voice was low. Are you sure you want to proceed this way? Laura nodded. He needs to be heard. Samuel studied her. He's unraveling. He always does when he's cornered, she said. I just never saw it from this side. The recess ended. Everyone returned to their seats. The examiner looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Carter, do you maintain that all actions taken were in the best interest of the company? Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. It felt like an hour. Yes, he said. Laura closed her eyes briefly. The examiner nodded. Then we'll continue. She turned to Laura. Mrs. Carter, are you prepared to submit additional materials? Laura opened her folder and slid a thin envelope forward. Yes. Daniel frowned. What's that? Laura's voice was steady. A timeline. The examiner opened the envelope, scanning the contents. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. This is thorough. Laura nodded. I had time. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his chest. The examiner looked up. This indicates you raised concerns internally. Yes, Laura said. Multiple times. Daniel scoffed. You never said anything. Laura turned to him slowly. I did. When you told me to trust you, she said. When you said not to worry. When you said I didn't need to understand the details. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. The examiner addressed Daniel. These records suggest a pattern of dismissal. Daniel leaned forward. Because she wasn't part of operations. Laura's voice cut through the room. Because you didn't want me to be. Silence fell. The examiner closed the file. We'll need further review. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is a setup. Laura didn't flinch. No, she said quietly. This is consequence. Daniel stood, breathing hard. You think this makes you right? She met his gaze. I think it makes me honest. The examiner stood. This session is adjourned. As they filed out, Daniel remained seated, staring at the table, as if it might give him answers. Laura paused at the door. "Daniel," she said. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "For what it's worth," she continued, "I didn't want it to end like this." He laughed hollow. "You always say that." She shook her head. "No, I always hoped you'd see it sooner." She left. Daniel sat alone in the quiet room, the hum of the vents, the only sound. He felt something shift inside him, a slow realization settling in. This wasn't a battle he could overpower. It was a reckoning he could only endure. And somewhere deep down beneath the anger and fear, a different emotion surfaced. Regret. It was faint, unfamiliar, but it was there. The first leak didn't come from Laura's side, and that was what unsettled Daniel the most. It appeared online late Sunday night, buried in a financial blog. Few people outside compliance circles read a dry analysis of governance failures that mentioned his name only once, almost casually. By morning, it had been picked up, rewritten, sharpened. By noon, it was everywhere. Daniel watched the coverage from his apartment blinds half drawn, the television volume low. Analysts spoke calmly, sympathetically even, but the words cut deep. Pattern of behavior. Failure of oversight. Questions remain. No accusations yet. Just the slow tightening of a net. His phone buzzed non-stop. He ignored most of it. Investors he once called friends now left clipped messages asking for clarity. A former colleague texted a single line, "You should get ahead of this." Daniel deleted it. Across the city, Laura sat in her office. The lights dimmed, reading the same articles. Samuel stood near the window, arms crossed. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone else is protecting themselves." Laura nodded. "They always do when pressure builds." "You expected this?" "I expected fear," she replied. "Fear makes people talk." Samuel studied her. "And does this change anything for you?" Laura thought for a moment. "It accelerates it." The next board meeting was called quietly off the calendar, attendance mandatory. Daniel found out an hour before it began through a forwarded email that wasn't meant for him. By the time he arrived, the room was already full. He took his seat without speaking. No one acknowledged him. Laura sat 2 chairs away, posture straight, eyes on her notes. She didn't look at him. That hurt more than any glare could have. Margaret Ellis opened the session. "We're here because circumstances have changed." Daniel leaned forward. "Because of rumors? Because of risk," Margaret replied. "And exposure." Daniel's voice was tight. "You're reacting to headlines. We're reacting to patterns," another board member said, "and to the fact that external parties are now asking questions we can't answer cleanly." Daniel turned to Laura. "You did this." She looked up, then, meeting his gaze evenly. "I didn't leak anything. But you benefited." She considered that. Truth tends to. Margaret raised a hand. "This isn't about blame. It's about decision-making." Daniel laughed softly. "So you've decided." Margaret didn't deny it. "We've decided to protect the company." The vote followed. Not dramatic, not unanimous, but decisive. Daniel felt the floor drop beneath him as the words settled. Temporary removal. Oversight committee. Restricted access. When it was over, he remained seated, staring at the table as people gathered their things. Laura stood gathering her papers with care. She hesitated, then turned toward him. "This didn't have to become public," she said quietly. Daniel's eyes burned. "You think I wanted this?" "I think," she replied, "that you believed you were untouchable." He scoffed. I was. She shook her head. You were protected. There's a difference. He watched her walk away, the room emptying around him. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like control. It felt like abandonment. That night, Daniel drank alone, the city lights blurring outside his window. His phone lay face down on the table. He didn't want to see who had stopped calling. The drink burned less with each swallow. He thought about the early years, the nights Laura stayed up with him reading contracts, pointing out risks he brushed aside. He had called her cautious. She had been right. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. We need to talk. It's about what's coming next. Daniel stared at it, heart pounding. He typed back a single word. Who? The reply came quickly. Someone who doesn't want to be the last one holding the bag. Daniel closed his eyes. The net was tightening. He could feel it now. Meanwhile, Laura sat at home, shoes kicked off, staring at the ceiling. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind exhaustion. She replayed the board meeting in her mind, the looks on their faces, the way Daniel's shoulders had slumped just slightly when the vote was called. It hurt more than she had expected. Samuel called. You should know, he said. There's movement on his side. I assumed there would be. He's reaching out. Fishing. Laura sighed. He always does when he's scared. Be careful, Samuel warned. Fear makes people unpredictable. Laura hung up and sat in the quiet. She thought of the woman she had been years ago, the one who believed patience could fix anything. She didn't regret waiting, but she understood now that waiting had a cost. The next morning, Daniel met his anonymous contact in a quiet diner on the edge of the city. The man sat across from him, eyes darting, hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. They're going to make you the example, the man said. Not because you're the worst, because you're visible. Daniel leaned in. What do you know? The man swallowed. There's a report coming. Comprehensive. It doesn't just look at decisions. It looks at culture. Leadership tone. That kind of thing sticks. Daniel's jaw tightened. And Laura? The man hesitated. She's cooperating fully. Daniel felt a surge of anger. Of course she is. She's not attacking the man, said quickly. But she's not shielding you either. Daniel sat back, heart racing. Can it be stopped? The man shook his head. Not stopped, but redirected. How? By giving them someone else to focus on. Daniel stared at him. You mean sacrifice? The man didn't deny it. Daniel left the diner feeling colder than when he'd entered. The city felt hostile now, every building a witness. He realized then that the game he had played for decades had changed. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about surviving. Laura received the call that afternoon. Samuel's voice was serious. Daniel is making moves. She closed her eyes. What kind? Desperate ones. She nodded slowly. Then it's time. For what? For the truth to finish what it started. She hung up and looked out the window, the city stretching endlessly before her. She felt no triumph, only resolve. Somewhere across town, Daniel Carter stared at his reflection in a darkened window, finally understanding that the quiet woman he had underestimated wasn't just reclaiming her voice. She was dismantling the world he thought belonged to him. The knock on Daniel Carter's door came just after dawn, sharp and deliberate, the kind that didn't ask permission. He froze mid-step, coffee cup trembling in his hand. The city outside his window still gray and undecided. The knock came again. Firm, patient, unavoidable. When he opened the door, two men stood in the hallway, dark suits, neutral expressions. One held a folder. The other glanced down the corridor, as if already cataloging exits. Mr. Carter, the man with the folder said. We're here to request your cooperation. Daniel's throat tightened. On what grounds? The man didn't argue. He simply held out the folder. Daniel stepped back and let them in. Across town, Laura sat at her desk, the early light slanting across the room. Her phone buzzed. She didn't pick it up immediately. She knew before she saw the number. Samuel Wright's voice was calm when she answered. It started. She closed her eyes. How bad? They're asking questions he can't answer cleanly. She exhaled slowly. Good. You sound tired, Samuel said. I am, she replied. But I'm ready. Back in Daniel's apartment, the men moved methodically, asking questions, taking notes, requesting access. Daniel answered with clipped precision the way he had in boardrooms for years. But this was different. There was no deference, no negotiation, just process. When they left, the apartment felt hollowed out. Daniel stood alone in the quiet, staring at the door long after it closed. He felt something slipping now, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a structure losing load, bearing beams one by one. He grabbed his phone and dialed Mark Feldman. Straight to voicemail. He dialed again. No answer. The silence screamed. At the office, Laura moved through meetings with measured focus. The oversight committee asked questions. She answered them. Not defensively, not eagerly, just clearly. She didn't speculate. She didn't editorialize. She let facts sit where they belonged. During a break, Margaret Ellis joined her by the window. You're holding up? Laura nodded. I have to. Margaret studied her. You're aware this will cost you too. Laura didn't look away. I've already paid. That afternoon, Daniel's name appeared again, this time with context. Not accusations, documentation, a timeline. Analysts debated what it meant. Commentators speculated carefully. The words were measured, but the implication was clear. The ground was shifting. Daniel watched it unfold from his couch suit jacket, still hanging where he dropped it the night before. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. It was the man from the diner. They're moving faster than expected, the man said, voice tight. Someone talked. Daniel's heart pounded. Who? The man hesitated. It doesn't matter. What matters is, they're framing it as systemic. And that puts you at the center. Daniel swallowed. What do I do? A pause. Then, you could cooperate. Daniel laughed harsh. And burn everything. You don't have much left to burn, the man replied. At least this way you control how it ends. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his reflection faint in the dark screen. Control. The word tasted bitter now. That evening, Laura received an email. Short, direct, a request for deposition. She read it twice, then closed her laptop. The room was quiet. She could hear the city outside, distant sirens, the low hum of traffic. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to brace, to minimize, to stay quiet. She stood up instead. Samuel entered a moment later. You saw it? Yes. You don't have to do this personally. Laura met his gaze. I do. He nodded understanding. The deposition was scheduled quickly, the room neutral, the setting controlled. No cameras inside, but the anticipation outside buzzed with expectation. Daniel arrived early, looking thinner than Laura remembered. His suit hung looser now. His eyes were rimmed with red. When Laura entered, he looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You're here. She took her seat across from him. I said I would be. The examiner began, voice even, methodical. Questions, clarifications, timelines. Daniel answered carefully at first, choosing words like stepping stones. But the questions tightened. The pauses grew longer. Laura watched him, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of distance. She remembered the man he used to be, or the man she thought he was. When it was her turn, she spoke plainly. She described patterns, decisions, conversations, moments when she had raised concerns and been dismissed. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize, she simply described what had happened. Daniel shifted in his chair. At one point he interrupted. "You're painting me as a villain." Laura looked at him. "I'm painting the truth." The examiner raised a hand, restoring order. As the session continued, Daniel's composure cracked. Not dramatically, subtly. A sharp inhale here, a clenched jaw there, the mask slipping in small ways. When it was over, Daniel sat back drained. Laura gathered her things. "Laura," he said quietly. She paused. "I never thought you'd do this," he continued. She turned. "I never thought I'd have to." They stood there for a moment, the weight of decades between them. Then she walked out. Outside, reporters waited. Laura kept her head down, moving past them without comment. She felt no urge to explain. The truth was already moving on its own. That night, Daniel sat alone again. The apartment darker than before. He poured himself a drink, then didn't touch it. His phone buzzed with updates he couldn't bring himself to read. He thought of the early days, the choices he'd made, the shortcuts he'd taken, because they seemed small at the time. Small things add up. Across the city, Laura lay awake staring at the ceiling, exhaustion settling into her bones. She knew this wasn't over. But she also knew something had shifted irreversibly. The weight she'd carried for years was lighter now, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. And as dawn approached, both of them understood in their own ways that the story they had shared was reaching its final reckoning. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday morning, quiet enough that it didn't crash the markets, but precise enough to rattle every boardroom Daniel Carter had ever walked into. The language was careful, clinical, almost polite. It didn't call him a criminal. It described conduct, patterns, decisions, consequences. Daniel read it sitting at his kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, the coffee beside him untouched and cold. By noon, his phone stopped ringing. That was when it hit him hardest. Across the city, Laura stood in a narrow conference room with the oversight committee hands folded, listening as the chair summarized next steps. There was no triumph in the room, only process, only gravity. When the chair finished, he looked at Laura. "You understand this will be public?" Laura nodded. "It already is. Are you prepared for what comes with that?" She met his gaze. "I've been preparing for years." Outside the building, Daniel watched reporters gather the way they leaned into each other, microphones angled like weapons. He stayed inside. He couldn't bear to walk through them yet. He watched from the lobby as security checked badges, as people he once greeted by name avoided his eyes. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. His lawyer, a new one now younger, less polished, sat beside him. "You'll need to decide how you want to proceed." Daniel stared straight ahead. "Proceed where?" The lawyer hesitated. "Toward resolution." Daniel laughed softly. Resolution. That's a word people use when they still have options. Laura's statement was released later that afternoon. Brief. Measured. No accusations. No commentary. She affirmed cooperation and emphasized the importance of accountability. She didn't mention Daniel by name. That omission hurt more than any condemnation could have. Daniel watched the clip alone. He searched her face for anger, for satisfaction. He found neither. He saw resolve. He saw clarity. He saw the woman he had spent decades misunderstanding. The court date was set. Not a trial, a hearing. Enough to determine scope, enough to lock in consequences. The night before, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, suit laid out beside him like a uniform for a role he no longer knew how to play. He thought of the early years again, of Laura's quiet presence, the way she had once asked him if he was sure about a particular expansion. He had laughed it off. He always did. The courtroom was full but restrained. No spectacle. No shouting. Just the low hum of anticipation. Daniel took his seat, shoulders squared, face set. Laura sat several rows behind him, flanked by Samuel Wright and Margaret Ellis. She wore a simple dress, understated her posture, calm. Daniel didn't turn around. The judge entered. Proceedings began. The language was dense, legal, methodical. Daniel listened as his actions were contextualized, not dramatized. That was worse. There was no villain speech to push against. Just a steady accumulation of facts. When Laura was called to speak, she stood slowly, every movement deliberate. She addressed the court directly, her voice even. "I'm not here to punish," she said. "I'm here to make sure what happened doesn't happen again." Daniel closed his eyes. She spoke of systems, of unchecked authority, of how silence can enable harm when it's mistaken for loyalty. She didn't speak of betrayal. She spoke of responsibility. When she finished, the room remained quiet. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." Daniel felt something collapse inside him. Not his career. That had been gone for a while. Something deeper. The story he told himself about who he was. The ruling was concise. Oversight, penalties, restrictions. The words fell into place with the inevitability of gravity. As people began to file out, Daniel remained seated. His lawyer touched his arm. "We should go." Daniel stood legs heavy and turned for the first time. Laura was watching him. Their eyes met across the aisle. No anger, no accusation, just a shared understanding that something irreversible had passed between them. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Reporters surged forward, voices, overlapping questions shouted. Daniel pushed through them without answering, head down, the sound washing over him like rain. Laura paused at the top of the steps. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Carter, do you feel vindicated?" Laura stopped. She turned slowly. "I don't feel vindicated," she said. "I feel responsible." The crowd quieted. "Responsible to do better than what I experienced," she continued. "Responsible to speak when silence becomes dangerous." She turned and walked away. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment, now sparsely furnished. Boxes lined the walls, half packed, half abandoned. He sat at the table again, the same place he'd read the indictment, and stared at the empty space across from him where Laura used to sit. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old messages. Photos, notes, fragments of a life that no longer existed. He stopped at one message years old from Laura. Just a reminder about a meeting. A simple question. "Are you sure?" He set the phone down. Across town, Laura sat in her living room, lights low, a glass of water in her hand. Samuel sat nearby, giving her space. Margaret Ellis stood by the window watching the city. "You did the right thing," Margaret said. Laura nodded. "I know. You don't sound relieved." Laura considered that. Relief comes later. "Right now there's work." Margaret smiled faintly. "There always is." As the night settled, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of power, of how easily he had mistaken it for control. He understood now that real power wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It waited. It observed. And when it moved, it didn't need permission. Laura stood at her window, looking out at the city she felt connected to again, not as someone hiding in its shadows, but as someone willing to stand in its light. Both of them understood in different ways that the reckoning was nearly complete. Only one chapter remained. The sentencing took place on a gray morning that felt heavier than the others, the kind of morning where the city seemed to move slower out of quiet respect for what was about to end. Daniel Carter stood at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit the way it once had. The fabric hung looser at the shoulders. His hair had thinned. His posture, once rigid with confidence, had softened into something closer to endurance. He did not look at the gallery when Laura entered. She took her seat beside Samuel Wright and Margaret Ellis, her movements calm, unhurried. She wore a simple coat, dark and unremarkable, the kind chosen not to be noticed. Her face held no triumph, only focus, only presence. The judge spoke carefully, each word deliberate. The findings were read into the record, not with drama, but with clarity. Breach of duty, failure of oversight, abuse of authority. The language was restrained, but the meaning was final. Consequences followed. Restrictions. Financial penalties. Long-term supervision. Not the destruction of a man, but the dismantling of the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Daniel listened without interruption. When the judge finished, there was no gasp from the room, no murmur, just a quiet acceptance that something irreversible had been set in motion. Daniel turned then. Laura felt his gaze before she met it. When she did, she saw no anger left in his eyes. No calculation, only exhaustion and something like recognition. He nodded once, not in apology, not in defiance, in acknowledgement. She nodded back. That was all. Outside the courthouse steps were crowded but subdued. Reporters waited, cameras ready, voices lowered. Laura descended the steps slowly, the cold air brushing her face. For years, she had imagined this moment ending in relief. It didn't. What she felt instead was steadiness, like standing on solid ground after a long crossing. Daniel exited through a side door, escorted quietly, his path narrower now. He didn't look back. Life moved forward faster than either of them expected. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. Another story took their place. The company stabilized under new leadership. Systems were reviewed. Policies rewritten. Meetings held where questions were encouraged instead of silenced. Laura returned to the office early one morning, sunlight filling the space as she set her bag down and turned on the lamp at her desk. The room felt different now. Not lighter, truer. Margaret Ellis joined her a few minutes later, carrying a folder. The board approved the final recommendations. Laura nodded. Good. Margaret watched her for a moment. You know there are people who still don't understand how you did it. Laura smiled faintly. I didn't do it alone. No, Margaret agreed. You did it by paying attention. Later that day, Laura walked through the building greeting people by name, listening more than she spoke. She paused at a conference room window, watching a younger woman present to a group, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. Laura recognized the nerves. She stepped inside, quietly, took a seat at the back, and stayed until the end. When the presentation finished, Laura stood and nodded. Good work, she said simply. The woman's shoulders relaxed. Across the city, Daniel packed the last of his things into a small apartment far from the neighborhoods he once frequented. The rooms were quiet, sparse, honest. He moved slower now, each action considered. He no longer rushed. There was nowhere left to outrun his thoughts. He sat at the small kitchen table that night, a single lamp casting long shadows, and opened a notebook he had bought weeks earlier and never used. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he wrote. Not defenses, not excuses, just observations, moments he had dismissed, conversations he had interrupted, silences he had misunderstood. He closed the notebook and set it aside. For the first time in years, he slept. Spring arrived without ceremony. Trees budded along the sidewalks. Cafes set out chairs. The city breathed easier. Laura stood at her window one evening, watching the light fade, thinking of the woman she had been when she first chose silence. She didn't judge that woman anymore. She understood her. Survival comes before clarity. But clarity, once found, demands action. Samuel joined her holding 2 glasses of water. "You did something important," he said. Laura accepted the glass. "I told the truth. That's rarer than people think." She took a sip, then set the glass down. "The hardest part wasn't standing up," she said. "It was letting go of the version of myself that believed standing up would destroy everything." Samuel nodded. Instead, it rebuilt it. Laura smiled softly. In the months that followed, she spoke less publicly. She focused on work, on systems, on people. When she did speak, it was measured, grounded. She didn't frame herself as a victim or a hero. She framed herself as a participant in something larger than one marriage or one company. Sometimes late at night she thought of Daniel, not with anger, not with longing, with distance, the kind that allows memory without pain. The story ended the way many real stories do, not with applause, not with revenge, but with accountability and the quiet return of dignity. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with these 3 words: truth over power.